A friend of mine, a historian based in Manila, once told me something over coffee that genuinely stopped me mid-sip. She said the hardest part of her career wasn't research, it wasn't funding. It was convincing people that Filipino women held political power centuries before European suffragettes marched for the vote. Not symbolic power, real, governing, diplomatic, military commanding power. That conversation stuck with me for years, and it became this video. If you're watching this on Echoes of Ancients, welcome. Subscribe if you want stories that challenge what textbooks left out. Now let's get into it. There's a popular myth floating around online. It goes something like this. Ancient Philippines was a scattered collection of primitive barangays with no centralized authority, no literacy, no diplomacy. Colonizers arrived and brought civilization. Neat story. Also spectacularly wrong, the pre-colonial Philippines was a sprawling network of polities, trade partnerships, and tribute systems that connected it to China, India, Borneo, and Japan. These weren't isolated fishing villages. They were organized maritime societies with legal codes, written scripts, and stratified governance. The Laguna copperplate inscription, dated to 900 CE, references debt forgiveness across multiple communities and mentions connections to places in what are now Indonesia and India. That single artifact demolishes the primitive islands narrative in one sentence. Filipino societies were deeply embedded in regional politics and economics long before any European ship appeared on the horizon. Precisely horizon. Zoom in closer now. Among these societies, something remarkable kept surfacing in Chinese, Arab, and later Spanish records. Women ruled, not behind the scenes, not as regents waiting for a boy king to grow up. They governed outright. Stop for a second. Why is that surprising to anyone? Because colonial historiography specifically erased it. Spanish chroniclers frequently minimized or misunderstood female leadership. They came from a culture where queen's consort existed, sure, but executive female authority was rare and often resented. So when they encountered Babylon priestesses wielding political influence or chieftainesses negotiating trade agreements, they either ignored it or filtered it through their own patriarchal framework. The records are there if you dig. But you have to dig past 3 centuries of deliberate reframing. Chinese dynastic records are more revealing. The Song Dynasty Annals and later Ming Dynasty documents reference trade missions and tribute exchanges with polities in what they called May-I, Sulu, and other island groups. Some of these records describe leaders of Filipino polities in terms that indicate female rulers or co-rulers. The Sulu Sultanate's own genealogical traditions speak of powerful women in leadership, including Paramasulay, a title sometimes attributed to female rulers in the early formation of the Sulu political structure. Now, was there a single massive empire with queens who made China pay tribute in the way a clickbait headline might suggest? Let's be careful here. The tribute system in Chinese diplomacy was complex. It wasn't always about submission. Often, smaller polities sent tribute to China as part of a trade protocol. China got to feel like the center of the world. The tributary got access to lucrative Chinese markets. Both sides benefited. So when Filipino polities participated in the tribute system, it was shrewd commerce disguised as deference. And some of those polities were led by women. Here's where the bureaucracy of history becomes infuriating. The Spanish colonial administration actively dismantled indigenous governance structures. They replaced local leadership with appointed gobernadorcillos. They converted communal land systems into encomiendas. They systematically stripped power from Babaylan spiritual leaders, many of whom were women or gender-fluid individuals, recasting them as misunderstood figures in the colonial context. This wasn't a grand conspiracy. It was banal administrative policy. Colonial officers followed manuals. They filed reports. They checked boxes on forms designed in Madrid by people who'd never seen the Pacific Ocean. The erasure of Filipino female leadership wasn't a sinister plot. It was paperwork. Think about that. Entire political traditions wiped out because some bureaucrat in a tropical office decided that women couldn't possibly be rulers, so he wrote chief's wife instead of chief in his ledger. Dig deeper into one specific case. The polity of Ma-yi, referenced in the Song Dynasty text, Zhu Fanzhi, written by Zhao Rukuo, around 1225 CE. This text describes organized trade with Mai, detailing the protocols. Traders would arrive, spread goods on mats, and local leaders would negotiate exchanges of beeswax, cotton, and precious goods for Chinese porcelain and silk. The description suggests sophisticated commercial governance. While the Zhu Fanzhi doesn't always specify the gender of rulers, cross-referencing with indigenous oral traditions and later accounts suggests women frequently held authority in these trading polities. The Babaylan class, overwhelmingly female, served as spiritual and often political leaders simultaneously. Separating religious from political power is a modern Western habit. In pre-colonial Filipino societies, the two were inseparable. A Babaylan who performed rituals and mediated with the spirit world also mediated disputes, authorized trade, and led communities through crises. That's governance. Full stop. Now, here's the part that makes my historian friend want to flip tables. When modern scholars try to reconstruct this history, they hit a wall of colonial-era categorization. Spanish records sorted indigenous leaders into categories that made sense to Spanish administrators. Indigenous women who held power got shoved into categories like priestess or healer because the Spanish bureaucratic system had no checkbox for female sovereign. The forms didn't allow it, literally. The administrative templates shipped from Spain had categories for male leaders only. So female authority got miscategorized, underreported, or simply omitted. Not because someone decided to suppress the truth, because the form didn't have the right box to tick. Bureaucracy didn't conspire against Filipino queens. It was too blind to recognize them. The Boxer Codex, a late 16th century manuscript, contains illustrations and descriptions of various peoples in the Philippines and surrounding regions. Some depictions show elite women adorned with gold, tattoos, and symbols of rank that parallel those of male leaders. The gold alone tells a story. Pre-colonial Philippine gold work was extraordinary. The treasures found in sites like Surigao include pieces of craftsmanship rivaling anything produced in contemporary Europe or mainland Asia. These weren't trinkets, they were regalia, symbols of authority worn by people who commanded obedience, brokered alliances, and managed economies. Some of those people were women. The gold doesn't care about colonial paperwork, but the dynasties themselves, the lineages of female rulers, are harder to trace. And this is where intellectual honesty matters. Can we claim with certainty that there was a single unified empire ruled by a continuous dynasty of queens that forced China into a tributary relationship? No. The evidence doesn't support that specific framing. What the evidence does support is arguably more interesting. Multiple Filipino polities, some led by women, engaged China in tributary trade relationships that were mutually beneficial. These polities were sophisticated, literate, and powerful enough to participate in the most lucrative trade network in the medieval world. They didn't need to be a single empire to be impressive. The obsession with finding a single grand empire mirrors a European model of statehood that doesn't fit Southeast Asian political reality. The Mandala system, where overlapping circles of influence radiated from centers of power without rigid borders, was the norm in this region. Filipino polities operated within this model. Trying to squeeze them into a European framework is another form of colonial thinking, even when done with good intentions. Here's something that rarely gets discussed. The resilience of female authority in the Philippines didn't vanish under colonialism. It went underground. It adapted. The Babylon traditions survived in modified forms. Women continued to hold informal authority in communities even when formal power was reserved for men by colonial law. The revolution against Spain in the 1890s saw women like Gregoria de Jesus and Trinidad Texan take on leadership roles that echoed pre-colonial patterns of female authority. That wasn't random. It was cultural memory asserting itself through centuries of suppression. The bureaucratic forms tried to erase the queens. The culture remembered anyway. Modern Filipino society still carries traces of this heritage. The Philippines has elected 2 female presidents. Filipino women participate in the workforce and in politics at rates that surprise observers from other Asian nations. Commentators often attribute this to American colonial influence or Catholic education. Rarely do they look further back. Rarely do they consider that maybe the reason Filipino women exercise authority with such confidence is that their ancestors did the same thing 1,000 years ago, trading with China as equals and governing their own polities with full sovereignty. The real scandal of this story isn't that ancient Filipino queens existed. The evidence for female political authority in pre-colonial Philippines is strong and growing stronger as more archaeological work gets done and more indigenous oral traditions get properly documented. Well, the real scandal is how ordinary the erasure was. No villain sat in a dark room plotting to hide Filipino women from history. A clerk used the wrong form. A friar wrote priestess instead of leader. A colonial governor skipped a paragraph in his report because it didn't match his assumptions. Death by 1,000 bureaucratic cuts. And the correction of that erasure isn't happening through some dramatic revelation from secret archives. It's happening through patient, unglamorous work. Archaeologists cataloging gold fragments, linguists decoding old inscriptions, historians cross-referencing trade records with indigenous genealogies. Nobody's kicking down doors. They're sitting in libraries, reading old forms, fixing the checkboxes. That might not be the dramatic story you expected, truly expected. A tale of queens making empires tremble, reduced to a conversation about administrative templates and colonial paperwork. But that's the truth of how history gets lost and found, not through grand conspiracies or secret vaults, through the slow, quiet work of people who care enough to read the fine print. Well, somewhere in the Philippines right now, someone is doing exactly that, sitting with an old document, a magnifying glass, and the patience to correct a mistake that's been standing for 400 years. No crown, no throne, a quiet room, and the stubbornness to get the record right.